Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 26th weekly Franczek webinar since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Jackie Wernz, your host for our webinar today. This week's webinar is all about accommodations. So we're going to discuss all of the very complex accommodation and leave issues that districts are dealing with. We're delighted to have you with us for the next hour, and thank you for joining us today and for submitting your questions during registration. Please also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions during the webinar, and we will do our best to cover them all today. So today on our panel, you'll see a number of familiar faces of our regular panelists. We have Nicki Bazer.
Hi, everyone.
Dana Fattore Crumley.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And Shelli Anderson.
Hello.
We are also pleased to be joined by our very special guest, our partner and labor and employment co-chair here at Franczek, Bill Pokorny.
Hi, everybody.
Before we jump into our evaluation discussion, our accommodations discussion, we want to highlight our topic for next week, which will be staff and student speech. It's gone viral. So we're going to talk about all of the crazy things we know you're dealing with respect to staff and student speech these days. Keep an eye out for a registration announcement in the coming days and let us know any questions you have through the registration process or by emailing us at covid@franczek.com. And as always, if you find yourself looking for more information or if we're not able to get to your questions today, please reach out to one of us for information. If you missed any of our webinars, you can find them all on our website under events at franczek.com. And while you're there, please take a look around at our mini webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts on a wide range of school law topics. Okay, so with that, let's talk all about accommodations. So let's start out with probably the question that's on most people's mind the most these days, which is working from home a reasonable accommodation under the ADA? Bill, can you talk to us about that one?
Yeah, absolutely, Jackie. And like with any good legal question, the answer is it depends. So the key consideration whenever you're looking at whether an accommodation is required under the ADA is, does that accommodation allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their jobs? And before COVID, the courts and even the EEOC were really, in a lot of cases, skeptical that remote work was a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. In a lot of cases, remote work is just not physically an option if the employee is going to perform their regular job duties. You can't have a custodian log in over the internet and clean the floor. It just doesn't work that way. For teachers, supervising a room full of students who are there for in-person learning would be extremely difficult, to say the least, over the internet. Now, I know that that's being tried in some places, and we'll see how that works. But there's a good argument there that it's just not feasible to allow that employee to perform the essential functions of their job. But what we're seeing now is jobs are changing because, for example, districts are going to full remote instruction. And in those cases, it may be a reasonable accommodation to allow somebody to work remotely. And we're also having a situation where there are, maybe an employee cannot perform their regular job duties remotely, but an employer, a school district, has other positions that do involve remote work that are now opening up because, for example, they're offering a virtual academy alongside in-person learning. So again, it really depends on what the job in question is. Can that job be performed remotely? And then if not, are there alternative positions that can be performed remotely for which the employee is actually qualified?
All right, great. Now, I'm laughing about your statement about online learning as my two children are upstairs doing who knows what on their computers right now.
I think we all have online learning going on presently.
We do.
Right. So if a teacher is granted an accommodation to work from home while we're in a period of remote learning, do we have to continue to allow them to do that once you go back on a hybrid or in-person format? Shelli?
Yeah, Jackie, this is a question I think we're getting a lot, and I think it's really come up again now that districts are looking toward the possibility of doing some sort of hybrid instruction, those who've been doing remote for the last few weeks or month. And the answer to that is no. You do not have to allow them to continue necessarily in a remote position just because you've been able to accommodate them during the period of remote learning. The one caveat I want to say to this, though, is that you have to really look at what your district is offering to determine whether or not it could be a reasonable accommodation. Because I think districts are looking to one another and saying, well, the teachers in this district are able to do it versus the teachers in this district are being told that they are not permitted to do it. And it really does matter about the type of education and instruction that you're offering to kids. So if you have, for instance, a group of teachers who are specifically designated as remote teachers for your remote learners who are going to stay remote for the entire period and not come back to school, that might be a reasonable accommodation to allow some teachers to remain in the remote environment. But if you're not going to have that, and you are expecting all of your teachers to be in to teach students who are in the building, you don't have to create a new position for a remote teacher. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is with some of our teachers right now. They haven't envisioned that during the whole scope of COVID, that there is now this remote teaching position that's available to them if they have an underlying health condition that doesn't otherwise allow them to be in the building.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, one of the questions that came in ahead of time had to do with the difference between certified versus non-certified staff. And I think that related to, again, this question of accommodation, potentially work from home. And I think both Bill and Shelli touched on this in relation certainly to teachers, and Bill mentioned, for example, you can't have a custodian doing work remotely. So the difference there is really, again, drilling down into what are the job responsibilities? Can they be conducted remotely? And so you may have a difference, and likely you do, have a difference between what you can offer for your teachers in terms of teleworking or working remotely versus the folks that you need to have in the buildings. You know, your food service workers, if you're preparing meals for kids to pick up, again, your custodians, some of your, secretarial staff, all of the folks who sort of make the building run likely do need to be in the buildings and can't perform their job remotely. So there will be some differences, but that again is really based not so much on certification versus non-certification, but again, the factors that Shelli and Bill went through related to, can you do your essential job duties remotely?
So if a teacher is granted an accommodation to work from home and that has been allowed, but then they have some type of on-campus extracurricular activity or other activity, can you restrict that teacher from performing those activities on campus, Dana?
I think definitely you can. Some of these requests, because of how much things are changing and because of how districts are deciding is the best way to come back, whether remote or in person, and whether the teachers are going to teach from the building or teach from their homes. I think so many factors play into that, and it just, but for this situation, if you can't be in the building, it's really hard to say that you can then be at an extracurricular activity, which could be in the building. And we know just by the nature of the extracurricular activities that are running, some of them are sports. We've had guidance from the IHSA on that, in that you could have a situation where someone is injured, someone is ill, someone, gets hit in the head with a golf ball, and you need to attend the student. Even in the safe sports, we can have injuries. So I think it just doesn't make sense to staff that way. We have to give accommodations, but I think in the school context, you also have to think about student service first and how that's essential. You go back to the essential function that Bill was talking about. You have to, if they can't do the job with a reasonable accommodation, then we're at a different place.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing though, some of these doctors are writing notes that just indicate, cannot be in the building during the school day, whether it's with or without children, but can be on the football field supervising kids outside. And when you look at that, while we might have to, initially look at the underlying health condition and determine, well, does that even make sense? There's also a liability component to this, because if you know that teacher is not able to be in a building with or without kids, such that their underlying health condition might be exacerbated if they were to contract COVID, for instance, the we have to look back at the fact that we have this presumption under the Workers' Comp Act that if they do contract COVID, it's presumed to have happened at school. And there's a liability issue there with respect to if that case were to go forward, as well if they couldn't take care of the kids that they were supposed to be supervising. So I think some teachers are looking at it as a punishment to say, we can't come in during the school day, so you're punishing us by not allowing us to do our extracurricular, which is where we earn additional money, and really take some talking through with the unions, especially as to the reason why this doesn't necessarily make sense for the district.
Right, and you can't forget the duty that we have not only to students, but to staff to keep them safe. And, we can't have someone coming back if it's not safe.
So that's all talking about teachers. What about staff? Can you treat staff differently with respect to accommodations, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ADA is a little bit different than a lot of the other anti-discrimination laws that we deal with. The usual instinct when we're thinking about how do we treat employees is, we have to treat everybody the same, right? We got to treat everybody equally. What the ADA says, though, is look, for people who have disabilities that require accommodations for them to perform their job, there are situations where you have to do things for those employees to allow them to perform their essential job functions that you may not do for other employees. So under the ADA, the law specifically says, the EEOC guidance specifically says that you have to look at the individual employee's situation. What are their medical needs? And even within there are sort of common themes that we're seeing with COVID in terms of the accommodation requests that we're getting. But even within that, there are variations on what people need, what they can do. Somebody's doctor might just say, look, we just need to make sure everybody is wearing a mask around this employee. Well, okay, I can accommodate that employee and I don't necessarily need to provide them remote work if everybody around them is going to be wearing a mask. On the other hand, somebody who even with a mask is, has such a severe immunodeficiency that they can't be exposed, maybe they do need remote work. And you have to look at those individual situations. You have to look at the job, what's actually feasible, what are the district's needs, what are the students' needs, and make those individualized determinations. So it's not just, can we treat people differently? In a lot of cases, you actually have to.
Yeah, and Jackie, you had mentioned that in the context of staff. This would apply to teachers, it would apply to your administrators as well. Bill's focus on the individual, assessment, the individual interactive process with someone, and what you end up providing as an accommodation. That's why it is really dangerous to get into these situations where people are comparing, especially across districts, what some teachers are allowed to do, what some staff are allowed to do. Everybody's individual situation is different, and it's also private, right? So, you have to understand as an administration that there's going to be some discomfort with having to say to folks, that some people get, there are going to be differences, and that's how we make sure that anybody with a disability is able to participate and be an employee, is that we're able to offer these accommodations on an individualized basis.
Absolutely.
So speaking of the individual facts you might receive, if a doctor for an employee says this employee needs an accommodation, they need to work from home, what information can we ask for about that individual situation in order to back up that request, Nicki?
Yeah, absolutely. We can certainly get information, and we should. We're getting a lot of, I know it will come as no surprise that I'm saying this because I think everybody's seeing this. We're getting a lot of one-line doctor notes that basically just say that someone needs to work from home. You absolutely can and should engage in a process with the employee requesting medical information if they've requested an accommodation. We have some forms that we recommend using where you can send them out to an employee. They will complete them to give more detailed information about their underlying condition, what accommodations they need, and then a similar form for a doctor to, again, provide more detailed information about, again, what the need is, what the underlying concerns are, and that's a great way to sort of start the interactive process of finding out, okay, so as you know, this is an accommodation that you've requested, but are there other accommodations that could also allow you to do your job that aren't working from home or something else that you've specifically requested? So it's a good way to start that interactive process. I do want to note, because I think this has caused some confusion, I've had this conversation with a number of HR folks, which is there is a difference. The FFCRA, there's a very limited set of information that you can request of an employee who's seeking leave for a COVID-related situation under the FFCRA. That is a different thing than the medical documentation that you can, and other information that you can request to grant an accommodation. You should think about this in your non-COVID world, right? So if someone requests a specific chair because of their back problem, you're allowed to get more information. Do they need the X2000 that's $8,000, or is it something that, I just made that chair up, that chair doesn't exist, but is it something that you can get a cheaper version, or, is there something else that they need? Is a standing desk something that they need as well, rather than something more complicated? So again, you can request that information so that you're able to start that process of figuring out what is the appropriate accommodation that you can provide for this employee to enable them to do their job.
I think when we're looking at these, we have a lot of times where we, as Nicki mentioned, kind of the one line that the employee needs to work from home. And sometimes they include what the underlying condition is, but making sure that you are asking the doctor through the employee to identify what is it about being in this building that is impacting the employee. So it's not just that we're expecting these doctors to have an understanding of what safety precautions are already being taken, what the air filtration system is, how far apart we can keep people, presuming they know that. I think some of them presume they know the answers and just say that they need to work from home. But I have found in most cases, when you actually push back a little bit and say, explain to me what it is about working in this environment that is causing this person to have a impact on something substantially limiting in their life, we find that there are other ways that we're able to accommodate, or the employee has to, as Nicki mentioned, start that interactive process where we can have a conversation about, are you not otherwise doing things in your life that would put the same risk on you, going to the grocery store, going out to dinner, otherwise living your life? It doesn't have to be specifically limited to a discussion around what's happening in the workplace. So I think the interactive process has never been more important than it is now.
Right. I think it's important for people that work, in education generally. This is not very much unlike what you do with students. You don't get the accommodation that you want, you get the accommodation that you need. And that allows you to do your job. And those two things may not be the same thing. And I do find that, Shelli and I were talking about this earlier. When you get the one-word answers, to put a little bit of meat on the bones and actually draft questions that the employee needs to take back to the physician about what the employee is doing outside the workplace, to really sort of drill down on that. And then also just to say what it will be like when the employee comes back. I think that when you provide no context for that, you may have a doctor writing something that imagines the person being in front of 30 first graders when the coming back situation does not match that at all. So I think you have to, it is a back and forth. It is not the quickest process, certainly by any means, which makes it difficult during this time when we have to make decisions quickly. But I think like Shelli said, pushing back will sometimes yield a better, more workable result ultimately for everyone.
Just one other point I want to make on this. Nicki talked about the forms as being a good way to start the interactive process. And as Shelli and Dana have pointed out, there's a lot of back and forth on this. So, I help draft the forms that a lot of our clients are using. So by all means, use those forms to get the process started. But I want to reassure everybody that they're not magic. And you can feel free to, if you need to modify the forms because you have an issue that's coming up in your district, do that. And feel free to run it by us if you have a question about whether your modifications are okay. If you have follow-up questions that you need to ask, you got a form back and you want to send another letter back to the doctor, you can do that. And again, if you need help figuring out what questions to ask, or can I ask this, we can help with that. But don't get hung up on, oh, this is the form I got back, this is all the information I have. That's just the starting point, the beginning of a conversation.
Yeah, that's really true. Although, Bill, we should not ever put down the smokescreen that our forms are magical, because of course all of our work is magical. But yes, feel free to adjust.
So Shelli, you mentioned earlier the remote positions. So what happens if you have just a few remote positions, but you have a number of employees who want the position? What factors should districts consider when they're making the decision of who gets the position?
Sure. So just putting some context around this so that we're clear for those individuals listening who may not have this. What we're talking about here is a district who's made a determination that for whatever reason, whether it's because they have a large population of kids who are going to continue to be remote, or they otherwise feel they can accommodate a number of teachers being remote while having somebody else in their classroom, either turning on their screen or otherwise supervising the kids. Districts made a determination that this number of individuals can be remote and they can still staff the building the way they need to. And again, the district gets to determine what their needs are with respect to staffing the building. That's not, the union doesn't get to decide that, a court shouldn't decide that, the district should. So the idea is, what do you do and how do you make a determination if you've got 20 people who want these remote positions and you only have 5? So I think the most important thing is, I don't want any HR person to feel like they should be making determinations as to whose disability is worse than the other. Certainly that's not we've all been doing things way outside our job descriptions lately. We know you all have too, but certainly that is not one of them. So when you're doing that, I think that talking to your union as to how you're going to make those decisions is going to help a long way, because you're going to have 15 people who are not happy with the decision that's made. And really, if you're going to be looking at it, obviously what certifications the individuals have, if you've got a specific, if you're a unit district and you need a certain number of elementary teachers and high school teachers, for instance, so looking at certification, if you're looking at seniority, but really working with your union as to, again, we're talking about the impact of how you're going to determine who's going to be assigned to these positions that you may have more people than you actually have positions available for. So I think those are some of the factors that we've looked at. And again, making sure that all 20 people who've asked for it, do they all actually need a remote position as an accommodation? So really going back to what we've just been talking about, we have found that many people who initially say they need to work from home because of their disability don't actually need that once we have all the safety and PPE parameters put in place for them. So, but it's a tough decision to have for those people who want it. I understand that.
So Bill, what happens if an employee, a teacher, if their request for an accommodation is denied? What options are available to that employee in that situation?
Well, at that point, if the employee is not able to come in and work in person, assuming they're looking for a remote work accommodation, then the option is really to request leave. So first off, we'd be looking at leave, COVID-19 leave under the FFCRA. If it's for the employee's personal health condition because they've been advised by a doctor that they shouldn't be leaving the house, basically, then that's 2 weeks of emergency sick leave, which obviously doesn't get them very far. After that is exhausted, we're looking at regular FMLA leave, assuming that the employee is eligible for FMLA. If they're not eligible, or if they've exhausted their FMLA leave, then we're looking at leave under the district's policies, and if there's a leave provision in the collective bargaining agreement that may govern. Obviously, sick leave may come into play there as well. Beyond all those leaves, then it's really a question of, is the district going to make any exceptions to its policies, or as a matter of, just humanitarian concern or practical concern, because we have people who just can't work, they're good employees, we don't want to lose them. Are we going to extend more leave than we necessarily have to under the law or our own policies? But really, those are the options if an accommodation is not available.
So you guys have mentioned a few times that there are other options than just working from home and leave. So Nicki, tell us, what are some of the other options that are available as accommodations?
Sure, and it's obviously going to be very specific to whatever program you're running, and I'd be interested to hear what other folks have heard. But obviously, you know, what we're talking about here is setting up safety protocols and, you know, providing teachers with or staff with things like additional PPE. So if they want, you know, we're talking a lot about face coverings, but if they need an N95 mask, assisting with that and getting them properly fitted. You know, some teachers have requested and received, you know, plastic barriers around their desks, as well as, you know, the mask wearing. You know, they're bigger classrooms so that there's more social distancing, coming in separate entrances so they don't have to go in the student entrance or where the students are coming in if they're in person. You know, so those are the types. So again, thinking, you know, some teachers have asked for air filters for their classrooms, you know, portable, those kinds of things. Again, I'm not certain of the effectiveness of those things, but those are the types of accommodations that you might be able to provide. You know, again, this is an interactive process. So if they're coming to the table with some ideas that their doctor or their health provider is thinking about, again, you're taking a look, seeing if you can provide that, if it's feasible within the school environment, if it's not an undue burden. So, you know, we encourage you to reach out to the individual to ask what they're thinking about, but those are some of the types of accommodations that we've seen that school districts are providing.
Yeah, I've also had, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dana.
Well, I was just to say, I do have a favorite accommodation. Can I share it? So sometimes people they can do part of their job, and this sort of addresses one of the questions, but I do think this is a great accommodation that I had one of my clients come up with. They can do part of their job remotely, but they can't do all of their job remotely. So we're talking really about staff people that might work on payroll or something like that, where you really have to be in the office. And I think flexible hours is like a very basic, reasonable accommodation. It's easy, allowing people to come in if the school building closes at 4, having them do part of their work from 4 to 7, and being in the building at that time, then they're not around others. That was just an accommodation that worked, that I thought was simple and, you know, implement. So I think it is like, there are so many, I think one of the reasons I like this area of practice, both from the student and the employee side, is there's so many possibilities. And people tend to just say, ugh, I want this or nothing. But it's like a kid that can't do their math problem. I can't do it. I just can't do it. But you can if you actually think for a few minutes and start the process as it's supposed to flow. So just
a few others that we've had come in that I think are easy. You just have to have, again, that process of talking to them, or, you know, a request for a classroom that has a window that opens. Or release from supervision duties if your teachers are expected to supervise in the lunchroom, for instance. So the idea being that you can't be around unmasked individuals. For right now, while a lot of districts are remote, we've had some requests to say for those districts who are requiring teachers to be in the building, although the students aren't, to not be in a shared classroom. So I know many of our high schools, for instance, have a classroom itself that is used different times of the day by different teachers. So the request coming in to not have a shared classroom. So again, the more creative you can be, and again, it's not all on you. The employee has to come to you with some ideas as well, to come up with kind of what they would otherwise be able to, you know, perform their job functions doing.
So I know we all have become accustomed to thinking about worst case scenarios. So I'm going to ask you about a worst case scenario. What if a school district denies a teacher's request to work from home, and the teacher comes to work and they contract COVID-19? What liability risks would they be facing, Dana, in that situation?
So I know this is a big concern, and probably one of the things that keeps school administrators up at night, because I think like safety is just so high up there on the hierarchy of needs. But I do think, you know, the fact that liability has a lot of, you have to show a lot of things to get to liability. I think there is you know, there's the workers' comp provision that we've mentioned briefly before that says if the employee contracts COVID, there's an assumption they have contracted it at school. So that's going to have, that has major implications, and you have to be mindful of that. But again, I think it goes back to the importance of the reasonable accommodation process and really making sure that you are making the accommodations properly. There is risk in this, and you could take the position that you're not going to assume any risk, but then we're never going to be able to be back. I mean, you could take that position before COVID, and that's probably not a tenable position either. So I know we get a lot of questions about this. I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks, because I know people are worried, but that is not a question that really keeps me up at night. I feel like clients are really engaged in the accommodation process, and they're thoughtful about decisions, and they're getting the information they need to make these judgments in the best way possible.
I do think this is a new area, though. I mean, I think typically when we've got our HR people who know how to handle accommodation requests that come in, it's not often that you have a situation where the person is denied the accommodation request because you can't do it, like in a remote position, and then they come to school anyway. So they're kind of denying or rejecting their doctor's assessment of their condition. And it could be for a myriad of reasons that they decide to do that. And really, I think the HR administrator having a conversation with that teacher about, we can't accommodate you the way your doctor is indicating you need to be. Is it really safe for you to be in the school building? And then I think that is a whole other discussion that needs to be had as to what else that they could possibly provide for the teacher, and why does that teacher feel the need to still come in? Is it for some other reason that they're looking for that? So more conversations than ever between teachers and administrators. That is not my dog, by the way. Those of you who know me, I have 2 dogs. This is my neighbor's dog barking, so I'll go on mute.
And I think what Shelli said is absolutely right. I think it's also important for everybody to remember that there is also risk in excluding employees from the workplace. If you have somebody who's disclosed they have a disability, and all of a sudden you're going to say, well, you cannot come to work, that could be problematic as well. Now, there might be situations where that is what you have to do, but just realize that is not a risk-free proposition either.
Maybe it's comforting to people that the courts are so backed up these days that, there's not a whole lot of litigation going on. I don't know. Probably not a comfort, but hopefully some of the things you guys provided will be. So we are obviously living in a world now where we have everyone in our homes all of the time. We are finding out information about things, about people that we never thought we would know in the workplace, in school. What about these accommodations? Who can or should a district tell about accommodations, Bill?
So, this is definitely a sensitive subject. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, information about accommodations and any medical information you receive about an employee has to be kept confidential. Now, that doesn't mean that you can tell absolutely nobody. For example, if you need legal advice about how to deal with an accommodation request, you can, in fact, talk to your lawyers. I know I have had employees who claim otherwise and are very upset that the district asked for legal advice about a situation, but you can definitely do that. You can also share that information with other people within the district who need to have that information in order to evaluate the accommodation request or implement the request, where there's a business need for the information. Now, those individuals should obviously also be informed that this is confidential information and shouldn't be shared with anybody who doesn't need to have it. And you should be judicious about what information you share with who. So, for example, a supervisor of an employee who has an accommodation in place might need to know what the accommodation is. They need to know how to accommodate that employee and what's expected of them. They don't need to know the medical details that led to the employee being granted that accommodation. So, so-and-so needs to work remotely, or they need to leave early. That might be all the information the supervisor needs. They don't need to know that so-and-so has an immunodeficiency disorder and is affected in this way by it. So just be mindful of what information you're sharing with who. Also be mindful that all of this medical information, hopefully you already have a separate medical file, that you keep this information separate from the main personnel file to preserve that confidentiality. The tricky situation you may get into is employees asking about a coworker. I saw that so-and-so is able to work remotely. Why did they get that? Perhaps why did I not get that? And the answer there is you cannot say, oh, well, they have an ADA accommodation. The EEOC says that is not allowed because obviously you've now identified that employee who's receiving the accommodation as somebody with a disability, and you can't do that. So the response has to be, look, we make decisions based on all kinds of factors, and I can't disclose why so-and-so received a certain assignment to you. That's private information. And I hope that, if you had a request and needed something, we would keep that information private for you as well. But, please respect your coworker's privacy and leave it at that. But you cannot identify that it's because of a reasonable accommodation, and certainly can't say what the reason, it's because they have cancer or whatever. You definitely can't do that. Now, if the employee chooses to share that on their own, they can, but you can't do that for them.
So I think that's what you just said is what I was thinking about, is that I think confidentiality has to be part of the conversation on reasonable accommodation from the start. Right. And I do think that while it is within the employee's control to reveal certain things, I also think, just based on the calls that I've been getting from some clients, that it is important to talk to employees, especially teaching employees, about what they're going to say if they're the only one teaching remotely and everybody else is, in their classroom and they're at home. Because I do think, again, it's their prerogative on what they're going to say, but I'm not comfortable, and I don't know, with second grade teachers, telling their class the nitty-gritty details about their medical conditions. I don't think that's appropriate for second graders. I think they're probably, dealing with enough uncertainty, whether or not they have to deal with whether their teacher is going to be sick or something bad's going to happen to them. So I do think we need to talk to employees. That needs to be part of the conversation for public-facing people, like teachers, administrators, anyone that deals with the outside world, because I think there is a good way to handle that, and there's a very bad way to handle that. And mindful.
That's true. And there are also some accommodations where you may need to inform somebody's coworkers. You need to be very careful about social distancing with this employee. I can't tell you why. If they want to share details with you, they can. But and you should work with the employee who's getting the accommodation to say, okay, this is the accommodation we're providing. We have to tell your coworkers, let's talk about what information is going to be shared, what you want shared with them, and get that out up front so that you don't have issues on the back when somebody's expectations are upset.
Yeah, and I just want to add really quick about what Dana said. It is not just the second graders who should not be receiving information. Right. So we have a number of situations where we have teachers who are upset that they are not going to be able to continue to work remotely, for instance, once we go back to a hybrid plan, who we have learned are telling their students that because of their disability, and they're sharing what it is, and because the district refuses to allow them to continue to work from home, they're going to have a new teacher, and how upset they are about this, and that they don't know what they're going to do with their life now that they're not going to be able to continue teaching. This is all inappropriate and unprofessional behavior, and when you find out about it, the district should take action and meet with that teacher to talk about where those lines are and what they should and should not be discussing with their students. So I think, yes, with the second graders, but I think it goes all the way through 12th grade as to what we're expecting.
Amen.
I would definitely agree with that. I think we're going to talk about this a little bit next week on our viral episode. And I've heard anecdotal information from some parents about teachers also emailing students about, the reason, or telling parents, the reason I am getting you this information last minute is that I don't understand how to use these platforms because the district didn't train me, or, sort of all sorts of stuff is coming out right now, understandably, because everybody is in a pandemic. And so I think with the disability issues, with the other concerns that teachers may have, obviously the goal is really not to have students shouldering these issues. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to navigate those issues next week, but particularly in the area of disability, that's a heavy load to put on a kid, as Shelli puts, regardless of age, in terms of having to shoulder what it means that their teacher may have a disability, I think it's just too much. And that's really a great conversation to have up front with the teacher.
The theme is Zoom is not therapy.
Although you can get therapy now on Zoom,
you can,
so and if you need
and
it.
HIPAA may apply to that. We're getting to HIPAA next.
Right, right. Yeah, and definitely join us next week. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. And if you've had any situations involving any kind of speech or other activity like Nicki's talking about, send it to us in your registration so we can use it as an example during the webinar. Shelli, I hope I can ask this question with a straight face. Is it a HIPAA violation to share information provided by an employee about their need for an accommodation?
Okay, so I think we've addressed this in a number of webinars, so we're just going to say it again, that despite what many employees still believe, it is not a HIPAA violation for you to share information that has been provided to you by the employee related to their need for an accommodation or their medical condition. You are not a healthcare provider, you're an employer. So if you share information with someone who you should, or you inadvertently share information with someone you shouldn't, it could be a confidentiality issue, but it does not rise to the level of a HIPAA violation if you do that. So I think that's just something that we need to get away from, this idea that every time medical information is shared, it somehow involves HIPAA. It just does not. So hopefully, I'm sure we'll still talk about it in webinars to come, but just wanted to make that clear as we're talking about medical information related to accommodations here.
People do love HIPAA.
They do. They do.
They love referencing it.
So speaking of questions that we received during the registration process, we received a very interesting question about what happens if an employee comes to you with a doctor's note that is from their spouse's doctor and that relates to their spouse's condition, and they are requesting an accommodation. Bill, what are your thoughts on that?
So under the ADA, an employee is entitled to an accommodation for the employee's disability. There is no state, federal law that provides or that requires an employer to provide an accommodation for an employee who has a family member with a disability. Now, this is different than like the Family and Medical Leave Act. Obviously, if you have a family member with a serious health condition, somebody might be entitled to leave for that. We have the FFCRA leave provisions that do have some family member provisions, but those are talking about leave from work. They're not talking about remote work accommodations. So, legally, there is no obligation to accommodate an employee with remote work because of a family member's medical situation. Now, there may well be circumstances that would cause a district to want to do that. For example, you may prefer to provide somebody with a remote work accommodation rather than have them take leave because you'll have difficulty filling their position if they are on leave. There might be humanitarian reasons to do that. We don't want to expose people's family members or require people to work in a position that exposes their family members to this horrible illness. But from a legal perspective, you're not required to do that.
Yeah, and I think that this is going to be an issue upcoming because I think so for the districts that are remote right now, even the districts that are requiring their teachers to come in to the buildings to teach, I think districts have been very open and flexible about, okay, so if someone has an elderly parent or a child or a spouse that has a disability, a condition that makes them particularly vulnerable to COVID, that they're allowing those teachers to work from home rather than come in and teach from the school building. I think this is going to be much more complicated as districts try to go back to in-person, and I think, or even in a hybrid form. And I think we're going to start getting all the questions come up that we got when districts were intending to go hybrid, right? So do you have to grant these? And again, as Bill has said, legally, no, and it may be that at that point you can't accommodate by offering telework if you need your teachers in the building with your students. And so then again, we're talking about obviously, if are they eligible for some other type of leave? And so I think this question became a little bit easier to answer when everybody was remote because you could be super flexible. As folks go back in person, I think it's going to be trying to balance out all those needs and issues while getting enough folks in their building in front of your students.
So before we go on to talk a little bit about the FFCRA, let's take our questions that we've received about accommodations. So our first question is, if a department assistant can perform some of the job remotely, but is unable to perform other aspects of the job remotely, can the district deny the accommodation request? Should the district offer part-time work remote and hire someone else to complete the work that must be done in the building? Do we have to offer this option? Shelli, what are your thoughts on that one?
So I think that for a question like this is going to be where we really highlight the interactive process and figuring out what it is that the employee can and cannot do. So I guess the question I would have to the issue that's raised is, what is the type of work that can't be performed remotely? And is it feasible for that person to potentially take kind of a part-time leave so that we can bring someone else in to do that part of the work, for instance? So you don't have to remove someone's job duties just because they can only do part of them that you can accommodate. You have to work with the employee to say, well, we can allow you to do this portion at home, but that would mean that this whole other portion is not being able to be fulfilled by you, and therefore you would in effect be on a leave potentially for that portion of the day. Or if it's like Dana mentioned, I mean, is there a way that you can have the employee come in later in the day if the issue is really being around other people, that they can't actually do it in the building? So I think it's so fact specific, but that there are a lot of opportunities for discussion around, you know, if you want to be able to allow that person to do the work that they can do remotely, how are you going to fill the other half of the job? And there's, you know, a lot of answers to that depending upon what the needs are of the district.
Okay, another question. Even if working from home is a feasible and a reasonable accommodation, is the district required to provide this option if it can otherwise accommodate the teacher's needs? So for example, a teacher with a medical need was provided an assignment to teach remote students as an accommodation, but is being required to fulfill that assignment from her classroom. Bill, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so, you know, as I think we stated earlier in the webinar, the entitlement here is to an effective accommodation. It's not necessarily to the specific accommodation that the employee has requested. So I think Nicki gave the example of the employee has asked for the fancy $8,000 chair, but there's this $400 chair over here that would do exactly the same thing and address the employee's need. You don't have to buy the $8,000 chair just because the employee asked for it. When we get into these cases, though, the debate is always with the employee and sometimes their healthcare provider, is the alternative accommodation that you're offering equally effective? So, you know, and this particular question, we've all had this question from clients, I think, at this point. You know, the employee wants to work remotely. We've provided them a completely sealed off, isolated office in which to work. They don't have to see anybody on their way into the building. They won't have any contact with anybody. Can we require them to come in and work from that office? Well, yeah, it sounds like that should be equally effective as working from home. And if that's the case, then yes, you can require them to come in. But, you know, the employees and their doctors may have things to say about that. Like, how are they going to use the restroom? Is there a risk of, you know, contamination there? Are there other issues that may require them to interact with people in a manner that's unsafe? So you do have to work through those questions on an individualized basis. But assuming the accommodations are equally effective, yeah, you don't have to provide the specific accommodation that the employee has asked for.
Thanks, Bill. Another question, from what I understand, the ADA requires a doctor to describe a person's disability and the subsequent impact on essential life functions. Now we talk about underlying conditions, which may not be a disability. Nicki, what's the difference?
Sure, and I think this was a reference to maybe something I said using the term underlying condition. What we're talking about here is obviously if someone has a disability that meets the definition under the ADA, then they, and that disability is impacting their ability to do, you need to provide an accommodation in order for them to be able to perform their job duties. So if I used underlying condition, what I meant by that was simply a disability that met the definition of the ADA. So apologize if there was any confusion on that front.
I think where the confusion also is coming from, Nicki, is that we've got a lot of people out there who have a condition that outside of COVID would not be a disability under the ADA, right? So asthma comes to mind, is that we've got a number of staff out there across the state with asthma who have doctors indicating that it is substantially limiting to them because of COVID and because of the increased risk of harm to them if they contract COVID. So I think it's tricky when we use the word underlying health condition. it can rise to the level of a disability because of the situation we're in. Outside COVID, asthma itself may not otherwise be considered, depending on the person's circumstances, to be a disability that needs to be accommodated. So I think that also might be where the confusion comes from with that.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that several years ago, Congress amended the ADA to dramatically expand the definition of what counts as a disability. So, at this point, basically almost any underlying medical condition could be a disability if it has some substantial limitation on an employee's ability to work or perform other major life activities. And as Shelli said, the COVID situation makes a number of things that would not ordinarily be disabling. Those now do pose a legitimate barrier to a lot of people getting out and about and going to work.
All right, another question is, how would you respond to a staff member who has one symptom, such as a sore throat, and asks to work remotely for the day? Dana, thoughts on that one?
So I think there's a lot in this question. I think if it's one day and they say they have a sore throat, I think you're going to tell them to stay home because that's what our guidance is telling them. But I think maybe what the questioner might be asking is, what if somebody has a sore throat? And again, I think the same answer is, if the person has a sore throat in September and then has a sore throat the second week in October, they're just going to stay home. Let's not risk it. Let's see where that goes and monitor. I think what the person might be asking is, what if a person has a sore throat on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on Thursday and on Friday and the next week? And then I think it's like anything, it has a COVID aspect to it, but then I think we have to go into, we do need to use the policies that we have. And the school code says you can ask for a physician's note after a person has been sick for a while. So you should start down that path and let's get a note and let's see what you have. And maybe even as part of some sort of fitness to see if they're able to come back to work, they're going to be tested. So I do think it depends on the circumstances, how you're going to respond to this and what you think is going on and how to sort of progress through using the policies you have, but also being very mindful of the very conservative guidance that we're having to keep people out that may be ill.
Yeah, I think this is something worthy of, for those of you working with your unions on MOAs right now, as to kind of how you treat individuals who have a symptom and therefore have to quarantine per the IDPH guidance, what you can do with respect to those individuals if it becomes a recurring pattern. And so being very clear of what steps the district is going to take to either have them evaluated by a doctor to determine that it is in fact caused by something else, or have them tested to determine they don't in fact have COVID. The optic being that you want to get them back into the school building as quickly as you can to perform their job. And it's not that I think that there are a number of staff members out there who are kind of playing the system in terms of, saying that they have a symptom because they want to stay at home. But the truth of the matter is, there are a lot of employees who want to work from home and feel they can, and don't necessarily, they're frightened about coming into the school building. And quite frankly, to get past that, just keep communicating with people and letting them know all the safety precautions that you're taking and that why it is actually a safe thing to do to come to work.
All right, another question is, do you recommend a telework agreement or a telework policy for teleworkers to sign, which might include things like rules about reimbursement for expenses, creating a safe workspace, expectations to conduct classes without distractions, things like that? Shelli, thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I have, my initial thought is that the idea of creating a telework agreement leads to the assumption that you have telework available for employees. So I don't necessarily agree with that concept, and I have talked to a few school districts about that. That being said, to the extent that you have individuals working remotely, so for instance, if you have teachers who are being permitted to work remotely, either because the students are remote or you're being able to continue to do that, having a very strict guideline out there to those teachers of what the expectations are. So for instance, having a quiet workplace where you won't be interrupted, making sure you have, internet that works, that is reliable. All of those things, you want to make sure that the teacher understands. And quite frankly, your community also wants to know that. If your community knows that your teachers are being permitted to work from home, whether they otherwise would be able to take a childcare leave or because they need it for an accommodation under the ADA, they want to know that you've thought about it, that this is not going to be like spring, and we are going to have teachers in a place that appears otherwise like a classroom, and they're going to conduct themselves as if it's a classroom. So I think that part of it's important. Having a full telework agreement concerns me because I think that does give the impression that you are going to now have this telework availability outside of COVID, which I don't think many school districts are looking toward. So.
Exactly. I think what you said about making sure that it's clear to families, because I think it's one thing to be accommodating, we have to accommodate, but you can't forget in all of this is that your constituents and your school districts spent money on those buildings, and we've all been in those buildings. We miss being in the building with you. We miss seeing the science lab, and I can't tell you how much those things cost to the penny, the way maybe our colleague Eris could, or Brian, but I can tell you that they were expensive. And to not have them be utilized even in a remote fashion, there has to be a rationale for that. And there has to be some control around the product that we're delivering if we're not going to use that facility.
All right, Dana, if an employee is exposed or possibly exposed to COVID by a family member or non-family member, do we need to ask those people for their positive test results to prove the exposure?
You know, my inclination on this, and I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say, is we don't want to get stuck into this whole idea of everyone needs to prove everything in the land of COVID. I think that, you know, you have to make a decision in the short term. And if someone says they've been exposed, but they can't prove it right then and there, you're going to probably want to keep them out of school for a day and then determine what you're going to ask for. I think that you're not going to have, if you know that the person, someone is sick in the house, for example, you have a college kid that's come home or sick, and you know that, and you could, I guess, ask for proof, but I would not do that in the moment. I would take the safety precautions first and then go into the other things that you're going to do that are just typical. I don't know how anyone else feels about that.
Proof is really hard to come by right now. Right. My understanding is that if you don't go to your direct doctor and you just go to one of these clinics that are doing large COVID testing, that you are often getting a phone call from the institution letting you know if you're negative or positive. And then a week later or so, you're getting a letter in the mail confirming that. So they're not able, at least from many of the institutions I've talked to provide kind of immediate proof, so to speak, that you'd be able to provide to an employer. So I have a problem making that a requirement before you treat someone as if they are a close contact with someone with COVID.
And also keep in mind under the FFCRA, you're not allowed to ask for that documentation if it is an FFCRA covered leave. So just be careful about asking for too much in situations where it's not permitted.
Absolutely.
All right, our last question. An employee was notified that we are able to meet the accommodation they've requested and is expected to report to work in person, but the employee isn't comfortable returning to work because of a health concern for her husband, who is a transplant patient. She's refusing to report in person and instead teaching remotely. Now what, Nicki?
Yeah, I know that we've answered parts of this question, but I just wanted to sort of reiterate because there seems to be sort of an element of self-help here that has taken over this teacher. You know, again, if you have directed a teacher that they are to work and you have provided other accommodations, in this case, various PPE and other things, and the teacher just, you know, is not accepting of that accommodation, they can't just sort of take it upon themselves to work remotely. At that point, the option is either they come into the building or they take leave, which is something that they may be entitled to do here. So the idea, though, that teachers can just sort of make a decision at that point. Now, if they want you to consider other doctors' information or you want to engage in a follow-up interactive process, you can go down that road. But at that point, if the issue is, you know, their spouse's health, to which they are not necessarily entitled to an accommodation, and you do need them in the building, then their option is to take leave at that point. So.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you also to all of you for joining us yet again for this conversation. We're so appreciative for your questions. Please do join us next week for Staff and Student Speech. It's gone viral. I think it's going to be a good one. And send any questions or examples that you'd like us to consider to covid@franczek.com. All right, until next week, everyone, take care. Thank you.